So let's get everybody started here. I'm Paul. I'm going to be the room captain for this one. With me today presenting is going to be Alanna, and I'm not going to pronounce her last name because it's so close to mine. I'm going to butcher it. So Alanna is a registered dietitian with and diabetes educator from Kelowna. She's currently focusing her time on community insulin pump and sensor trainings, and she also works casually at the Central Okanagan Diabetes Centre. She's enjoying tackling the ins and outs and latest technology advances in diabetes. Previously, she spent 10 years working in the insulin pump industry and also enjoyed volunteer work at diabetes summer camps and being on staff at numerous children with diabetes conferences. She enjoys blending her professional and personal experience in type 1 diabetes to make the difference. She has 3 young girls who keep her on her toes at all times, and especially during this time, I'm sure of that. So today this is going to be, and of course she chose the best title ever because it's weird, Mastering Insulin When Food Gets Challenging. I don't think we can ever do that, but Alanna, I'm ready to learn.
We'll give it a shot. All right, thanks Ryan. Good morning everyone, or good afternoon depending where you are in the country or around the globe, that is. I guess it could be good evening for some as well. Thanks for joining. This is the second Connected in Motion I've done. I did the Canadian one earlier in the month, and I'm totally blown away by how we're able to get all these people with type 1 diabetes connected from our homes while we're in the midst of this crazy time. So I'm going to talk about mastering mealtime insulin. I'm going to make fun of my title a little bit because I think it's one of the most challenging things that we could possibly do. But I think food and diabetes is one thing we all struggle with. I do have type 1 diabetes myself since I was 9 years old, so totally get it. Sometimes it feels like we have everything figured out, and then we go and we eat something and it's like, well, how did that happen to me? So hoping that I can unpack some of those really challenging foods, especially today, and help you understand why what's happening is what's going on. Just a few disclosures. I work with all the different diabetes tech companies that we have up here. Very involved in all of that. So what I'm going to go through today, I'm going to start out by going through some carb counting and kind of what people are actually doing and what should we be striving for with that. I'm going to spend most of my time, though, probably on fat and protein, which is a topic I absolutely love to dive into. And those are those really challenging restaurant-type foods that always keep us on our toes. And at the end, we'll kind of go through some things on those high glycemic foods and a couple strategies around that as well. So most of you, when you were diagnosed, probably got some type of nutrition education on how to match our insulin to our food. And most of this nutrition education has focused on that carbohydrate is the main nutrient that affects our blood sugars. So carbohydrate's the king. We just got to focus on carbs. And we figure out our doses usually using an insulin to carbohydrate ratio with our grams of carbs, and boom, that's how most of us figure out our doses. There definitely is a lot of inconsistency out there as far as how accurate our carb counting has to be. So some people teach, let's get it right down to the gram, and some teach more like an exchange. Let's go to the nearest 10 or 15 grams of carbohydrate. So that can vary a lot depending on where you live and who you're seeing for your diabetes education. And even if we have this completely narrowed down, and this is where I say one of the most frustrating things is we may not get the best results in the end. And that, I mean, you're trying so hard, you count up your carbs, you have your carb ratio right, and you get thrown a total, where did this come from? And super frustrating, for sure, as most of you can relate to. So this is where I'm going to poke fun at this. Can we really master it? I don't know. And why is it so hard to master that mealtime insulin dose? And it's because there's so much that affects it, right? So I think we all would agree the carb count definitely plays a big role in how much insulin we need with our meal. And then we look at what our blood sugar is at going into the meal. So if my blood sugar is a little bit high, I'm going to give a little bit more. If I'm low, maybe I'm going to respond a little bit differently to that meal. I need to treat the low as well. Many of us have been taught about protein and fat, knowing that that's going to slow down that peak in the blood sugar rise. So that's going to affect things a little bit. Dose timing, many start to get into pre-bolusing. I'm going to dive into this more. Going to affect it. Activity, if you've been active or you're going to be active, that's going to affect that. And that's not just sport. That can be gardening. That could be vacuuming your house on a weekend morning. That's going to throw off how that insulin is used in your body with your food. The time of day. So many of us, I think, see morning more challenging than other times. what type of insulin, how much sugar, or is it the glycemic index, how much fiber is in my food. I'm stressed out, so my insulin's gonna work different. Where's my trend arrows? Somebody else cooked. If you're a female, it's a different time of the month. Now your blood sugar's thrown all over the place and nothing behaves the same. Alcohol, caffeine, actually, I'm sorry, I'm missing on here, but that throws in there as well. So like kaboom, right? And I think this is where we go, okay, it's a little bit more than just putting in my carbs and putting in my blood sugar and deciding what I'm gonna give myself for my meal. And this is why we're given so many curveballs and why it can get so frustrating, because there's so much that affects that mealtime insulin dose. And it leads us to feel a little bit like this. So I've been home with my kids a lot lately. This is an old favorite, Robert Munch, Angela's Airplane, but you can feel like this little Angela. Every time I sit down to eat, I'm like, okay, what button do I push? Or how do I change things? And it could be a smooth sailing day, or it could be boom, crash, right? And incredibly frustrating. There's so many little things to keep track of. So my goal is maybe not to master it. Maybe let's try to avoid the crash and burn landing, but let's just try and maybe make things a little bit smoother and a little bit of a softer landing. And that would be my goal today, is to give you a few little tips around that so that we don't feel like this crash and burn at the end of it. So the first thing is carb counting. So how accurate do we really have to be with our carb counting? So I'm gonna give you this poll here, if we can get that up on this screen. It's gonna see how accurate you aim to be, or how accurate you think we should be with our carb counting. Give you a few seconds here. Okay. Oh, we got a third category up. I don't have anyone skipping the carbs. That's good. All right. Good. So it looks like a large majority of you are within 5 to 10 grams. Some of you, actually about a quarter of you, still quite a few within that 1 to 2, and a couple of you saying within 10 to 15 grams. So you can see where I was saying at the beginning there, we're all told something slightly different. So it's not surprising that we see a little bit of a mix there. Most of you saying within that 5 to 10 though. Okay, so we can take that guy down. Oh, do I have to close that? Oh, I'll close it. Okay. So I think the big thing here is that we have to set ourselves up for realistic expectations. So here's where I'm going to say maybe we can relax a little bit on this. And if you think back to that slide I had with all of the bubbles, when we look at everything that impacts our mealtime dose, does getting to that 1 to 2 grams matter as much when there's all these other things that are impacting things. So I think it's anytime we can give ourselves a little bit of a break, it's a good thing. So this study from a few years ago came out, and it actually showed that our carb counting can be off by up to 20% and still give us a fairly in target post-meal blood sugar. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of okay, I don't have to be exactly bang on. And the other thing they found here is that people that counted in 1 gram increments actually didn't get any better accuracy than those that count in 10 to 15 gram increments. Again, there's all these other things that affect our blood sugar after we eat, right? And we even see differences in food labels. So even though the label's telling you it's 15, it could be off a little bit there as well too. So I'm just telling you to maybe relax a little bit on that and look at the whole picture of everything. And the other thing I tend to find is that if we get too caught up on getting that exact carb count, often what I see happen is people can gravitate towards packaged foods more than whole foods. So I think about like kids in schools, for example, it'd be easier to send them to school with a granola bar where it's labeled 19 grams of carbohydrate versus an apple where it could be 15, it could be 22, right? So I think it's good to look back at that basic nutrition. Hey, I want to have the fruit. I'm going to have to guesstimate a little bit, but guess what? I'm probably going to be okay versus having to rely on a packaged food to get that exact carb count. And the other thing we're starting to see too is that actually could the timing be just as or more important than the carb count itself? So if you have the carb count bang on, but your bolus timing is a little bit off, it may not help you out that much. So this study is actually 10 years old now. And if you've been to any diabetes conference, this is talked about a ton, especially now that we have more people using sensors. But it's always a good reminder. It's the one thing I find with those people that with diabetes I work with. I find this is one of the hardest things to get people to actually do in practice, even though they know it. So this meal here, the blue line is they bolused when they ate. So this is their mealtime, they bolused, up their blood sugar went, down it came. This green line is they bolus 20 minutes after they ate. So here they ate, blood sugar went up, and you can see that the 20 minutes after is almost comparable to the bolusing at the time they ate. This orangey or reddish line, depending on your computer, is that they bolus 20 minutes before they ate. You can see that their glucose curve is much, much smoother. So I find when people put on a sensor for the first time, this is one of the first things they notice, that our rapid acting insulin is actually incredibly slow, and we really do need to give it some time to kickstart. I find the pre-bolus, if there's only one meal you can do it with, definitely for breakfast. In the mornings, most people are much more insulin resistant and they really need to give that bolus a kickstart. And if you think back to the carb counting I was just talking about, if I can pre-bolus, that gives me more of a buffer. I'm not going to spike up quite so much, so that's going to give me a little bit more of wiggle room with my carb count if I can get that bolus in sooner. Okay. A big question I often get with that is, how do I do it? Right? So what are your tips on making sure that I pre-bolus? And I think start with the meal that's probably the most routine time of day for you. So for many people, that's breakfast. So think about your morning routine. Where in your morning routine is 20 minutes before you eat? Right? So for some people, I always like comparing the guys and the girls. For the guys who have a 5-minute shower, they probably bolus before they shower, get changed, go for breakfast. Whereas some women, or especially some of the teen girls, spend forever in the shower. They wouldn't want to bolus beforehand. So maybe once they get out, bolus, do their hair and makeup, go down for breakfast. So really important to kind of try and find a strategy with that and look at your own habits. So there's also a lot of talk now on the total amount of carbohydrate. And definitely, I'm sure many of you have heard so much about the ketogenic diet and other low carb diets out there right now. And there is a lot to be said about this. So I love, and thank you for coming to my session, because this guy here is on right now in one of the other sessions, but I'll give a big shout out to Adam Brown. He writes so well about this, and I've seen many people follow something similar and get really, really good results. And in here he says it was a huge game changer for him when he realized that trying to eat less than 30 grams at a time really made a difference in those post-meal blood sugars. So if that's something you're struggling with, that's something to consider. And I don't think it has to be a hard set rule. I think anytime we try with diabetes to go, I'm only going to eat 30 grams, well, there's going to be days you're going to eat more, but just know that if you're not able to follow it that day, you're going to get something a little bit different. So if it's a bigger dinner and I'm going to have 50 grams of carbs, maybe I'm going to really make sure I pre-bolus for that one, right? So I really like that one. And really the whole idea of that is if you have less input, you have less error, right? So when I said we could be off by about 20%, if you have fewer carbs, it's not going to have as big of an impact as these really, really high carb meals that can be really challenging to estimate. We do, though, have to keep in mind that our blood sugar is affected by more than just carbs. So this is where I have seen a lot of people trying a ketogenic diet or a very, very low carb diet, and they see these really big fluctuations in their blood sugar. And that's because, yeah, you can take the carbs out, but fat and protein actually have a big effect on our blood sugar as well, and we may need to adjust our insulin for those as well. Okay, so that brings me to our challenging foods. So even if you're a master at carb counting, there are certain foods that can be incredibly difficult to manage over and over and over and over again. So feel free to throw that food in the chat. I'm not looking at that, but see if there's someone that's got a me too. There should be. Almost everyone probably has pizza on there, a big steak dinner. Cheesecake is one of mine. We always have these foods where no matter what you do, it's a different result. And it can be different from person to person, right? So I have several colleagues who are fellow dietitians with type 1, and we can all go out to dinner at a conference and go, what do you think of this is, and what do you think that is? And we all get a different result in the end, and it can be super frustrating, but there's a lot of reasons why. So I'm gonna try to explain this through a case with a girl named Emma. So if you think of Emma in a perfect world, she's eating a very similar breakfast most days, and she figures out her dose based on her grams of carbs, her insulin to carb ratio, and she makes some adjustments for her activity levels. And usually she gets a pretty predictable outcome most days. So here's her typical breakfast: 2 pieces of toast, some peanut butter, some milk, half a banana, 58 grams of carbs. So on a normal day, she gives 5.8 units, pretty simple. And she would get after her meal, before her meal, she's kind of sitting in the 100s, up she goes a little bit, down she comes, and she's happy. Life moves on. on a super predictable day. So all of a sudden it's the weekend and it's prior to COVID. She's going out to breakfast with her friends at a restaurant. So now she's having something different, but she adds up her carbs and it's 58, exactly what she eats at home. So she's also having her toast, but she's having some bacon and an omelet, a few different foods, but she gives 5.8 units, same amount of carbs, same amount of insulin. So what happens to her here? So here's where she ate her breakfast here. She actually went down a little bit initially and she's like, all right, I nailed that, did really awesome. And then her blood sugar starts to climb up. And by lunchtime, she's hitting that 200 mark and she's like, oh man, what did I do? Like, that should have been really, really straightforward. I picked some familiar foods, similar carbs, what went on, right? And you could say, well, did she actually miscount it? She's out, she has some adrenaline going, she's got a pump issue. Like, what could have caused that different result? But I mean, it wasn't horrible. You could correct that and it would come down. But then as the day goes on, things get a little bit more frustrating. So now we see, so this is where we were. This was at lunchtime. So she had her normal lunch, she took 6 units with some correction. And as the afternoon went on, up and up and up and up and up, she climbed. And she goes way up here to 356 and she gives a correction bolus. It comes down a little bit and it won't budge. And she feels like she wants to pull her hair out. Who has had a day like this? Go ahead and put that in the chat. And you're like, what is happening? Right? And it just makes you want to do that big rage bolus, right? If you've heard that term before. So it couldn't possibly be from that different breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the afternoon, or could it? Right? So this is what I want to unpack for you. So if we were to break down, not just looking at the carbohydrate, but that home breakfast is about 19 grams of protein and 13 grams of fat. Her breakfast one, so here's the home one, is 19 grams of protein. The restaurant one was 42 grams of protein, and fat was 13 grams at home and 37 grams out at the restaurant. So really big difference in fat and protein. So before I unpack this a little bit more, I would love to know from some of you what you see happens to your blood sugar after a high fat and or high protein meal. So some options here: you get low right after the meal, 1 to 2 hours after, you get high 2 to 4 hours after, you go high many hours later, seems to be different every time, or you're someone who it doesn't seem to affect you. Can we get that poll up there? There we go. Yeah, big mix. And this is exactly what we see, is it's so different from person to person. Okay. We can probably leave it at that. So most of you, the largest majority is 2 to 4 hours, some of you 4 hours, and a large number, about a quarter of you, it's different every time. Absolutely. Okay, I'll just close that guy. All right. So let's unpack some of this of why this is happening to you, right? So when we look at what fat and protein actually does in our body, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So the fat itself tends to reduce that early post-meal rise. So when we saw on Emma, she actually went down a little bit initially. And a few reasons for that. The big one is it's delaying our gastric emptying a little bit. So anytime you've had a really high fat meal, you can feel that dinner sitting in your stomach, right? That food is not digesting nearly as quickly as something that's lower fat. Those carbs are going in more slowly. It also reduces the insulin sensitivity a little bit, so that insulin's not going to work quite as efficiently, and the effect can last for hours after you eat. Okay. Oh, and I'm just going to make a note. I can actually see a few people making some notes. These slides will be available afterwards, so if you want to give yourself a bit of a break writing stuff down, you can get them after. The protein also causes a late and sustained rise in high blood sugar. And there's a few mechanisms for this. Probably the biggest two is that it increases that glucagon secretion from our liver, so we get some glucose output. And some glucose is actually made from protein as well. So we do see a combined effect there. So together we get this delayed and sustained rise in our blood sugars after a high fat, high protein meal. I'm gonna just go over a little bit of the research because I think it helps understand what we need to do about it. So this study, way back from 2013, looked at a closed-loop insulin pump system with a high-fat meal and a low-fat meal. Both of them had the same amounts of carb and protein. One was 10 grams of fat, one was 60 grams of fat. So 60 grams of fat is about 4 tablespoons of olive oil, if you want to put that into perspective there. So that high-fat dinner had more hyperglycemia, more high blood sugars, even after the system had delivered more insulin for 5 to 10 hours after the meal. So not just this couple hours, it's 5 to 10 hours they had higher levels of insulin circulating after that. This study here came out just this January, and they looked at types of fat and different bolus strategies for high-fat meals. And you may have heard in the past, if you've gone to a lot of conferences, for a while we wondered if different types of fat affected our blood sugar differently. Here they actually found it did not make a difference, whether it was saturated or unsaturated or other things. They were all actually comparable. And they found the biggest increase was needed with the high-fat meal that was, again, about 60 grams of fat. And people needed about 21% more insulin and just over an hour and a half, 105 minutes. Okay, so that's another one. This one here looked at protein alone. And so this would be if there's any athletes out there that have protein shakes. Usually we don't eat just protein, but those protein shakes is the one isolated thing I can think about this. If you had that large amount of protein alone, they saw, again, delayed and sustained high blood sugars for 3 to 5 hours after they had this. They actually didn't study past 5 hours, so I question if it actually would have continued even longer. And again, this supports that we need more insulin dosing for just large amounts of protein. So if you have a protein shake and no carbs in it, you might actually need to give some insulin for that. This one puts the two together quite nicely. This study was done in kids and teens. And down at the bottom here, this is a low-fat, low-protein meal, and it goes to 300 minutes, so to that 5 hours. So that one, the blood sugar came back down. The middle two here are one's high fat and one's high protein. So again, it went up, but it came down not bad. This top one here is high fat and high protein combined. So you can see the blood sugar went up about a 2 hour mark here. It went up, but then it didn't start to come down like the other ones did. It stayed up and stayed up and stayed up and stayed up and remained higher for that right up until that 5 hour period. So that's, I think, what a lot of us find with these high fat meals. And I think the big thing to keep in mind is often these bigger meals that we have that are higher in fat and protein are a dinner meal. So especially if it's at dinner and you're having a later evening meal, maybe at 2 hours, so if it's 120 mark, you go to bed, it doesn't seem so bad, or you give a correction, and then you go to bed and it stays high all night, right? And I think this is where a lot of people go, well, I was okay at bedtime, and then I woke up with this really high blood sugar. Especially before we had sensors. I know as a kid with diabetes, sometimes my sister also had type 1, and we'd go to bed and I'd be like, oh, well, I did better than you did with that dinner. And then the next morning, one of us would be mad because their blood sugar's through the roof, and the other one felt that they were okay. So we could see that really delayed effect overnight. So what do we do about it, right? So we know we get this long, sustained high blood sugar from these hard foods. So what do we do? So I'm gonna talk first about insulin pump strategies with this. For those of you in the group who are on multiple daily injections, still listen, because the whole concept of how this works, there is a way to manipulate it and try to do it on injection. So I will be touching on that at the end. So just stay with me on this. So extended boluses, these have been around for a long time, but I find it's probably one of the most underutilized features on an insulin pump. And I think the reason why is because it's so hard to actually figure out how to do it. So what you do with an extended bolus is you split your bolus into 2 parts. So the first part you give immediately, and the second portion we give over time, and that's what covers those more slowly absorbed carbs and covers those effects of fat and protein. So here's a very simple example. If I was giving a 10-unit bolus, normally it would all go in at once. If I tried doing, this is just an example, a 60-40 split, I would give 6 units up front, and 4 units would be spread evenly over whatever time period I pick. Some people do think when they start using this that it's given as a separate dose, but it actually is spread out evenly over time. So the biggest question I get is, what's the best split? How do I split up for a high fat or high protein meal? And I can't give a blanket answer on this because no one meal is the same. So your pizza dinner might be different from your steak dinner, and it's so variable from person to person. So this is where we really have to get into customizing this. I'm gonna unpack this a little bit more here. And no one day with diabetes is the same, right? Nothing gets away from this having to check and adjust, because I could have had pizza last night and again tonight, and I'm gonna get a different result. So super frustrating, and it does make it hard to give a blanket answer for this. but I'm going to go through a few things on this. So before I go further, let's do another poll and see what you use if you do use the extended bolus features on an insulin pump, or if you don't, what do you think you would consider trying? So we can put the options up there. So the first option is doing 100% extended over an hour. The second option is doing a 50-50 split over 2 hours, 70-30 over 4 hours, different every time, or too much to think about. There's a few in that one. Okay, really big mix. Okay, that's good. So super variable from person to person. So think about what you just answered there. And as I unpack this, think about if you may change that, okay? But very, very different from person to person, which is what we actually expect to see. So when you decide on your extended bolus amount, I don't think there's ever a magic number that you can do every single time, because every meal there's going to be something different that impacts it. So for example, if I'm having a fairly low carb meal, if I'm having a Caesar salad and a steak, and I just have a few carbs from the crouton on my salad, I don't need as many carbs up, I don't need as much insulin up front because I'm not eating very many carbs. I need most of it extended. What am I having with the meal? So if you're having anything really fast acting, like a bread or a sweet drink with your meal, you're gonna need more in that initial upfront period to cover those really fast acting carbs and less extended for the rest of it. Am I getting a correction dose with it? Some of the pumps automatically knock the correction out and they just split the food portion of the extended bolus, and some of the pumps do not. So that's a really important thing to understand how your pump works with that, because it is different from company to company, because otherwise you would need to make sure that correction was included up front. And previous or upcoming activity levels. So if you're about to go, I don't know, to a soccer game or to something, you don't want all this extended insulin working while you're going to be active. So definitely something to consider there. So the normal bolus portion, so this first upfront part, I'm going to talk about first. So if you give the full amount upfront or too much insulin upfront, you do run that risk of getting low an hour after. So if you think about that pizza meal, for example, how many of you have, and you can feel free to chat about this, have given, okay, I'm ordering this pizza, it's this many carbs, I give the full bolus, and an hour, 2 hours later, you're low. And that's because that effect I was talking about, where you delay that gastric emptying, that food's just sitting in your stomach, it hasn't been absorbed yet, and all this insulin's coming in ready to work on those carbs. So that is where we often do actually have to back off on that dose, the initial upfront amount, so that we don't get that low within an hour or two after we eat. But if we don't give enough upfront, then we run the risk, if we extend the whole thing and we just do all of it extended, then we're gonna get this huge spike if we don't get enough up front, and then you're gonna be chasing it. So it's really tricky to balance this out. The extended portion, where we're getting that delayed effect of the fat and protein, is important to help prevent that overnight high blood sugar. And like I said, often this is an evening big dinner meal, and we can have that high blood sugar for hours and hours and hours overnight if we don't deal with it till the morning. So definitely something to consider. But can make it a little bit more challenging too, because we're all a little more fearful giving more insulin at night. So one thing I often do recommend is, if you really want to play with this strategy, pick a breakfast or a lunch meal to play with it for. Then you can watch your blood sugars throughout the day when you're awake, and not go to bed at night going, oh my gosh, I put in this extra bolus, I don't know how this is going to affect me overnight. It can be really fearful for a lot of people, or definitely start slow so that you're not worrying about those low blood sugars overnight. So the big question now is how long? So I think I've shown you enough studies here to prove that often with a high fat, high protein meal, those effects do last for 3 to 5 hours after the meal. So we need to definitely spread that out longer. So this is where, I did many advanced pump classes when these features were first out, and we used to say, oh, do a 50-50 extended bolus over 2 hours. At the end of the pump evening, everyone would go home and they'd be happy, things looked okay, and then they got, again, that delayed high afterwards. So this is where we do need to extend it for a lot longer. There's a fat protein unit method that I'm going to talk about in a minute here, but when we unpack restaurant meals with that method, we often find most of them do require about 8 hours of extended bolus insulin, so it's quite substantial. The other question is how much? So we do see now that we actually need additional insulin, not just extended insulin. And this is the kicker. the amount of extra insulin required does vary drastically from person to person. So we need to start small and just keep increasing until we find that magic number for us. We do have to be, as I talked about with the activity, but I can't emphasize this enough. If you are playing with these extended boluses, adding in extra insulin, trying to really get aggressive with getting those blood sugars down, be very, very careful if you have had any high activity in that day. We get those nighttime lows, and alcohol. Alcohol can cause low blood sugar for up to 12 hours. So I do know of people who have tried this and it's been a night where they're eating out and they're having more alcohol with that meal and they could really run into trouble with lows. So please use caution with that. The one saying I love to say is, my wine cancels out my cheesecake, right? That alcohol causes the low, the high fat causes the high, and they can almost balance each other out. Okay, so here's diving into this how do I split it? So this study from 2017 looked at what's this optimal split. So what they found was that people needed at least 60% of the dose up front, given as that normal bolus portion. If they gave less than 60%, they tended to spike a little bit too much, and then you're chasing that high blood sugar for too many hours. So about 60% up front. Then they found that people needed up to 70% delivered extended. So if you're looking at this, you're gonna go, who's this crazy dietitian? The math doesn't even add up. She can't even add up to 100. So yeah, exactly the point. It adds up to more than 100%. And so this supports the idea that we actually need more insulin beyond what is calculated with our carb ratio to curb those effects of those high fat and high protein meals. Okay. So I'm gonna go into this method, the fat protein unit method from Poland, which was started being researched about 2009. There's a ton of studies out there on it if you're interested in it. But basically what they do is they use this unique formula to figure out your insulin requirements for fat and protein. So they say give the normal bolus for the carbohydrate content of the meal. So go in, bolus for your carbs. Then you figure out your additional insulin requirements based on fat and protein using something called a fat protein unit. One fat protein unit is about 100 calories of fat and protein, and that's about equivalent for the effects on your blood sugar would be like eating 10 grams of carbohydrate. So you could say, just to simplify the 100 calories of fat and protein, about 25 grams of protein or each 11 grams of fat would be about one fat protein unit. Okay, and then you give that additional insulin as an extended bolus for 3 to 8 hours. Now, hold the bus for a minute, right? You guys are like, she just told us to relax on how much we need to carb count by, and now you're telling me to count fat and protein as well, right? It sounds a little bit like, oh my gosh, too much to handle. So I promise at the end I'm gonna show a more simplified way to do this, but I just want you to follow me through on this just to really understand how much extra insulin this can amount to. If you're a really detail-oriented person, I have a couple families I've worked with who have tried to use this. There are some who go for it, but there is a way to simplify it as well. So when you break down these fat protein units, if it's one fat protein unit, they say to give that extended portion for 3 hours. If it's 2, you go 4 hours, 3 hours, 5, and more than 3 fat protein units is 8 hours. And this is where I said almost every restaurant meal that I've calculated fits in this 8-hour category. And most of us are too scared to give extra insulin for 8 hours, especially at night. So that's why I say try it during the day first. Now we do have to be really careful about checking our basal rates and our carb ratios and all of our settings before we use this method. And the reason for that is many of us, if you're an insulin pump user especially, our basal rates are actually often compensating for some of the fat and protein in our meals. So if you look into your pump and you look at your basal rates and you see that in the evening your basal rates are actually higher than the rest of the day, chances are you're doing this a little bit with your basal rates and you're just giving that little bit of extra basal while leaving to compensate for that heavier meal. So we do have to carefully isolate for that. And in the studies, they actually have seen quite a bit of hypoglycemia because it can be a little bit too aggressive. So that's why I say if you do try this, start small so that if you're someone who's more sensitive to this, like I say, different person to person, you want to be cautious. So if we were to go back to Emma, who we met at the beginning, and look at her meals, I'm going to break down what this would look like. So if this was her restaurant meal that was 58 grams of protein, according to this method, you would give that normal 5.8 units immediately. I would question maybe we should actually drop this a little bit, because many people do get that low of an hour or 2 hours after they eat with something heavier. Maybe some people yes, some no. And then if we figured out her fat protein units, it's actually 5 fat protein units for that meal. So that would, because she's a 1 to 10 carb ratio, that was where I got the 5 units from. Then it would be extra 5 units over 8 hours. Which, when you look at the math of that, some of you may go, oh my gosh, that's a huge extra insulin dose. So this is, again, she's got a 1 to 10 carb ratio. So quite a bit and over a long duration. But you can see where she had that high blood sugar all afternoon. This explains, if she had done this, she probably wouldn't have seen that. Now, if we really wanted to apply this, I'm going to try and simplify it a little bit. So as I said, 1 fat protein unit is about 100 calories of fat and protein, and that's equivalent on your blood sugar to eating about 10 extra grams of carbs. So many standard portions of meat, fish, poultry, any of that is about 1 to 2 fat protein units, okay? So you take a regular piece of chicken, it's about a 1 to 2 fat protein unit. So what you could do is you could consider starting with putting in 5, so 10 would be doing the full amount, right? But maybe start with 5. I'm gonna put 5 extra carbs in my pump as an extended bolus for an extra portion of fat and protein, right? And then you wanna definitely consider that alcohol and exercise for sure. And then do your testing at 2, 4, 6, and 8 hours and see. So very simplified, I'm having a single burger, I give my normal bolus. Today I'm really hungry, I'm having a double burger. That's an extra portion, so maybe I'll put in an extra 5 grams of carbs. I'm having a double burger with extra cheese and extra bacon. Maybe I'm gonna count that as 2 extra fat protein units, and maybe I'm gonna put in 10 if I'm being cautious, or 20 if I'm feeling like I have really figured this out. And then you do your durations that way. So it can be a little bit of a more simplified way to do it. A lot of people go, well, what does that really look like? What's 100 calories of fat and protein? So here's just a few examples to put it in perspective. So about a tablespoon of butter or oil, tablespoon of mayonnaise, an ounce of cheese, 2 to 3 ounces of, so the meat one is a tricky one, because in the dietitian world, portion sizes are way smaller than the restaurants. So 1 portion of meat is about the size of a deck of cards. Okay, so if you go out for a big steak dinner, you could have 3 extra decks of cards worth of meat sometimes on your plate. So if you think of the thickness of a deck of cards and the size of it, that's what 1 portion would be, that 2 to 3 ounces. 2 fat protein units, you're getting to 2 scrambled eggs. Those higher fat meats, for sure, a steak or a pork chop would fit more into that. Okay, so you could kind of play with it that way and go, okay, it's an extra serving of meat, that's an extra 2 fat protein units, so I'm gonna put in some extra carbs extended. So for Emma, if we were to simplify this, her at-home breakfast, if I did the math on it, is actually 2 fat protein units. Okay, when she ate out, it was about, if we're quickly doing it, that's an extra 2 portions, high fat. Here's an extra 2 portions, so I get 4 fat protein units. And here's where, if I want to be really cautious and I'm starting, her normal doses are usually covering about 2 fat protein units. So if I'm just starting to play with this, maybe I'm not going to give extra insulin for 4, I'll just take the difference and give extra insulin for 2 fat protein units to be cautious, okay? There might be more questions on that at the end. And here's where I do want to challenge you to call up and get an appointment with your dietitian. So dietitians often get stuck talking about the same old, but this is a really neat topic that's really fun to play with if you want to take the time to unpack it. So maybe go, okay, can you help me figure out how much fat and protein I normally eat? So you can figure out what your normal is, and then figure out what you can do if you have more than that. Definitely look at those basal rates and seeing, am I compensating for this already? So like I said, my house, I've got young kids, almost every dinner we eat is loaded with cheese, right? So my basal rates in the evening actually compensate, and I have a little bit of an elevated rate just to cover that off. So when I eat out, what do I have above and beyond what's normal, and how do I deal with that? Always review those first. Also, obviously, if you have any type of digestive concerns, gastroparesis, anything, these effects are going to be very different in you. Same with some medications. And again, that caution with alcohol and activity levels. So some other strategies, if that is too complex, and it is a very complex thing to do, but now I think hopefully that helps you understand how much more and that we do need more. You can find your own way to play with this as well. So some people talk about, okay, it's a high fat meal. I've heard many people go, just give 25% more to your bolus dose, right? And that can be more simplified. I've seen anywhere from 15 to 35%, depending if it's fat, protein, or the two combined, and use an extended bolus. The only thing I would caution with just using that percentage is if you eat very different amounts of carbohydrate, it's going to give you a very different answer. But if you eat a pretty consistent amount, then doing just a percentage increase can be a simple way to do it. A temp basal increase is another brilliant way to do this. So if you know every single time I eat out at such and such place, I end up high, then why not just turn up that basal rate a little bit? Again, start small, but doing that temp basal increase can really help. We're finally getting to get some help from the hybrid closed loop systems. So if you are fortunate enough to be using any of those, definitely you're going to see that basal rate crank up, which is exactly what we need. So to me, the insulin pump company that can come up with the best algorithm to handle this is going to totally win all my votes. So I'm really excited to see what's coming out with that. Right now, we do have to play with that a little bit. So this additional bolus 2 hours later, definitely with the Medtronic 670G, if you're using that, it will max out on the basal. Because you can see how much extra insulin is actually needed for quite a long period of time. So if you get that max basal alert at night, that's probably what's happening. So this is one time where I would say, you know what, 2 hours later, go in and put in some extra carbs to mimic what was happening with this system. With the tandem control IQ, we don't quite have that up here in Canada yet, but you can actually still do an extended bolus from my understanding with that, and it won't cancel out. So there's different things with different companies. I'm very excited to see what's coming out in the future with this. Very promising things for sure. And if you have other suggestions, feel free to throw that in the chat box. There's lots of neat strategies out there. So if you're an injector, thank you for hanging in there with us through all of this. But what you can definitely consider doing is, if you do notice that you do drop off that 1 to 2 hours after, pull back a little bit on that mealtime dose. Okay, that's something definitely to consider. And what you'll probably need is to try to mimic that extended bolus and give an extra dose a couple hours later. I'm going to show you a study on that here. I've also had a couple people that have had prescribed for them other types of insulin that more closely mimic the effect of a high-fat, high-protein profile and have had success with that. So this study here from, again, 2016, looked at this in people on multiple daily injections. So the blue line here in the middle is a low-fat, low-fat meal. So they had a fairly predictable result here. And the top black line is them doing just their normal dose. So kind of the same here, but you can see this delayed effect that went on for several hours. The green line here was they actually gave 30% extra insulin up front, and you can see it was actually a little bit too much. They got a little bit low. The red line, what they did is they gave their normal dose, and then they gave an extra 30% 3 hours later. And you can see that they stopped that high that happened when they didn't do anything. So that's definitely a strategy to consider, or playing with what that might work out to be for you. But that extra insulin dose to mimic what a pump would do is definitely something that can work. Okay, I'm doing for time. So another challenge that a lot of us get are these fast carbs, these high glycemic foods, and we talk about a lot, you know, no matter, they call it rapid acting insulin, it's still too slow, can't keep up with everything. So especially if there's any breakfast cereal eaters out there, or anyone that likes those high glycemic foods, whether it's for convenience or habit or whatever it might be, sometimes they just cause that blood sugar to shoot right up, and it's really hard to get it back down. So what are some strategies around this? So like I said at the very beginning, getting that bolus timing a little bit earlier is really going to make a big difference. I have had people that need to pre-bolus, like in pregnancy even, I've seen some people pre-bolus 45 minutes before they eat a breakfast meal because it takes so long to get that insulin kicking in and give it a good kickstart for a high glycemic meal. This would also be a good time to go, okay, I really love cereal in the morning. Maybe I don't have a giant bowl, maybe I have a smaller bowl because this just makes me spike too much. So reducing that total amount of carb can make a big difference, or choosing something different, right? There's lots of different options. So whether it's instant oatmeal versus steel cut oats, they're gonna have a different impact. Adding fat or protein. So I've just showed you that slows everything down. So if I'm having something too quick, or maybe I miss my pre-bolus, add some protein, add some nuts and seeds. Anything you can do to kind of slow it down is gonna make a difference. Same idea with fiber. Food order is something we don't talk about a lot, and I don't like people to obsess too much about making sure they have to eat things in a certain order. But if you have a food that every time you eat it, it really makes you spike, you can definitely consider, well, maybe I should eat my salad and my protein first and eat that bread at the end so that it's going to be digested a little bit more slowly. That is something you can try. And the cooking method even can make a difference in glycemic index for foods as well. But sometimes you try everything though, and it's not enough. So I'm going to just quickly show this idea of a super bolus. So this has been around for a long time. John Walsh has talked about this. He's got more information about it on his website. But basically what you do, if you haven't seen this before, so a normal bolus for this person would be 6 units based on their carbs. They use an insulin pump and their basal rate runs at 1 unit an hour. So when they have a high glycemic food, up their blood sugar spikes, over 300 here, and then down it back comes, versus on a normal meal, they don't spike nearly that much. So what they do with the super bolus is they take their 6 units and they go, I need extra help. I'm going to borrow some of my basal, I'm going to take a loan, and I'm going to give it early so that I can really give that bolus a good punch. That's going to stop me from spiking so much, but normally if I gave 3 extra units, I would crash and burn later. So then what they do is they actually suspend the pump for that same duration. So they stole 3 units, which at 1 unit an hour is 3 hours worth of basal. So then they suspended the pump for 3 hours so they could give it a really good hit, but then have a smooth landing at the end without crashing. So that can work really nicely for some of those super challenging foods. If you're nervous about suspending your pump, I've had some people that have taken this approach and they've modified it and they've just stolen half of the basal and they run a 50% temp basal. This is going to get harder to do as the pumps get smarter. We can't really trick them. And a lot of the actually hybrid closed loop systems are actually doing this. So if you're on one of those systems, sometimes what you see is after you eat, you've actually gotten more aggressive with how much you give for your carbs. And when you look at how much basal it's being delivered, it actually shuts off after you bolus. And that's what it's doing. It's trying to allow you to give a really aggressive bolus, pull back on the basal so that you don't crash and burn later. So really promising things and coming up with this in the future where we won't have to think about it quite so much. So I guess at the end of the day, it's not easy, right? But there are, if you go, okay, each one of us is unique, we definitely can work with this. And hopefully just understanding, okay, some foods, they're hard and they're hard for many reasons. And I think not beating up on ourselves for it is such a big thing. So many times we go to eat and the next morning, oh, I got it wrong. My carb counting's terrible. And it's like, well, it wasn't maybe the carb counting. It's probably something else that actually did that. It's not always our fault. But just understanding, so those high fat, high protein meals, they are really have a long effect. So we need to do something for about 3 to 5 hours. And even if all of that was too complex, the strategies, even if you go, okay, this is going to affect me for 3 to 5 hours, so I'm going to test and correct as I go so that I don't get this really, really whopping result later. You can find something that works for you. Those high glycemic meals often do need either an earlier dose timing and or more of a punch to kind of deal with them. And no answer works for everyone, right? So I wish I could give you a really nice recipe of do this, 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 and this, but it is going to be different from person to person. So try something new, try and keep a log of it. I love to give everyone permission at the end of this. I get to say, you get to pick the next restaurant or takeout or whatever it is for the next few meals in your house. Order the same pizza 4 times in a row and try something new every time, and everyone in your house has to put up with it because it's your experiment, and try something different until you find something that works. And it may not be bang on, but even if you can get it a little bit better, that's going to help. So I think we've got a couple minutes for a few questions here, if we have any. Or maybe we don't. Just waiting for the guys here.
There we go. I just had to unmute myself. There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Curious if you have any pointers / experience with Afenza?
Oh, Afreeza, probably.
Afreeza, that's it.
Yeah. So we actually don't have that approved. That's my downfall of being a Canadian speaker. We don't have that approved up here in Canada yet. But I have heard anecdotally from some colleagues in the States who have used it to get that faster result up front. A little bit faster, I think, than FIASP, which I have seen some people talk about not needing to pre-bolus quite as much, but there still are some foods that even those really fast-acting insulins still do cause us to spike too much. So even though, like I'll say with FIASP, I have definitely seen, oh, they say you can give it when you eat or after. I'm sorry, if you're having a bowl of cereal, you still need to pre-bolus. But maybe a mixed meal, you don't need to pre-bolus. So again, very, very person dependent. So, start with kind of your normal and adjust and watch your blood sugars. You have an option to use a sensor, see how it impacts you.
Okay. How much is too much protein, or does it differ per person?
So it is person dependent, depending on if you're an athlete or what your lifestyle is. But yeah, we can have too much of anything. So I think at the end of the day, we do need to make sure that we have some balance. We have to watch our kidneys a little bit, right? We live with type 1 diabetes, so if we overdo it too much, it can be too much. So look at a balance, work with your dietitian. We can do it based on body weight and a few things. You should be able to get a customized result for that.
Okay, and then looks like one more. Where can we learn more about this?
Where can you learn more? So pop into, I would encourage you to go back to your diabetes team and talk about this. And I've done a number of in-services in the area that I live on this with our diabetes teams, but there's a lot of stuff online. If you're looking at fat protein unit, the studies are done in Poland, but just keep educating yourself, search it, and again, be careful what you read, because no one thing is going to impact everyone the same. So to me, the big red flag is if you read something that says, do this bolus split, go, okay, maybe I'll try that, but it might not work for me. I'm going to need to adjust it. So I think you need to just start with trying something and then test your blood sugar and adapt it as you go. Definitely, I recommend Adam Brown's book is phenomenal as far as a lot of food tips. So Bright Spots and Landmines is his book. Really, really good suggestions on the effects of food. And he's got some good tips in there on how to get your fat and protein in there, or sorry, lower glycemic, especially with, he's big on the protein, nuts and seeds. There's some good suggestions in there.
Okay. Do you notice any difference in these figures with a gluten-free diet?
Yeah. So you can see differences for sure. So it depends what types of foods you're buying. So many celiac-friendly foods or gluten-free foods, especially the packaged foods, actually do have a higher glycemic index. Not all. Or often I see things like the granola bars and any of the baked goods actually have more sugar in them. So really just watching that and seeing how you do that. And the total amount of carb can be higher too. So if it ends up being more carb, then you're going to see a bigger swing up, right? So watching those labels and, again, watching how it affects you.
What kind of pump are you using right now?
I actually don't have my own in-warranty pump right now. I've been trying everything right now, everything under the sun, approved and not approved. So today I'm wearing a Tandem because I've been trying out their new system we just got in Canada. But I've tried the Medtronic 670G. I've tried lots of other things. I was an Animas pumper for a long time. So just testing everything out right now.
Awesome. Do you see a difference in animal protein versus vegetable protein?
Yeah, so that was, I used to, there were many of us who for a long time thought that saturated fat, so animal fat, cause more insulin resistance than unsaturated fat. This new study that just came out in January was the first one I've seen that actually showed that that was not the effect. So I'll be very curious to see if more research comes out on that, for sure. I think the thing with animal foods is that, and actually, now that I think about it, I think you said protein, not fat. Animal foods tend to actually be higher in fat and protein together, right? You think of your steak and your bacon and your cream sauces, those do tend to just have more calories in them total. Whereas if you look at a vegetable protein, it maybe is higher in protein, like beans and lentils and all those things, but it doesn't have the fat component added in with it, or not as much. So maybe we don't see quite as large of an effect with those.
Looks like just another one. How do you feel about intermittent fasting?
So for me, when it comes to those different patterns, we've seen fad diets for years. You can go back and study them for years and years and years and years. My biggest question always is it something you can stick with long term? So if doing intermittent fasting is going to be a short-term thing for you because you have a family and you're missing meals with them because of how you're doing this, then if it's not going to be sustainable, it's a lot of work to figure it all out, and then we can set ourselves up for beating up on ourselves if it doesn't work out or if we give up in the end or we can't handle it. So I think making sure you're finding something that fits with you and that you can do long-term is definitely a bigger deal. You definitely will see if you're going for longer periods of time without eating, yeah, your blood sugar is going to be more stable for many hours of the day. Absolutely. And I've seen people drop their blood sugar or their A1C or flatten their overall glucose profile by doing that. But you just do want to make sure that it's sustainable and that you're having healthy eating patterns with that.
Awesome. What is your threshold for high protein or fat meal? 10 grams, 20 grams, different fat versus proteins.
So a lot of the studies, so the 60 grams of fat was really big in a lot of those studies. That one proteins alone study, I believe they used about a 12 ounce, the equivalent of about a 12 ounce steak in that one. But again, I think it's going to depend on what's your normal. I really feel strongly that most of us have set up our own insulin regimens, whether it's a pump or MDI, based on your normal. So if you eat very low fat diet, maybe you're a low fat, high protein, and then you have a lot of fat one day, it's going to have a really big effect. If you're a moderate fat protein eater, then when you have a little bit more, maybe it won't affect you quite as much. So I think you have to look at what's normal for you and how much more is it from what you normally eat. A vegetarian that goes out and one night decides to have a steak dinner and they stop being a vegetarian for a day is going to see a really big effect versus somebody who eats meat every night. So look at your normal and adapt from there.
Awesome. Well, Alanna, thank you very much for this. This has been an awesome hour with you. Where can they find you if they need to find you?
Yeah, so I have my email address here on the bottom. So if you do have any more questions, definitely feel free to reach out to me and I'll try and get as best an answer back to you as I can. I don't mind taking those at all. If you have any feedback as well, something more you'd like to know for next time, I'd love to hear that as well. So thank you and enjoy the rest of hopefully a sunny day where you are and enjoy the rest of the workshops.
Awesome. And I believe that these are going to be posted on Connected Emotions website, the chat here.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people were asking about that. Otherwise, again, thank you very much, Alanna. It's been awesome.
All right. Thanks, guys.